set the stage, let me talk a little bit about our subject, which is industrial policy post-election. Under President Joe Biden, the United States has embraced industrial policy in ways that break from the past. In addition to investments in infrastructure, science, and human capital, the U.S. has identified sectors for active government support. Through the Science and Chips Act, the U.S. is offering roughly $280 billion in new funding to boost research and manufacturing of semiconductors in the United States. Through the Inflation Reduction Act, the U.S. is investing in many aspects of the transition to clean energy, including an estimated $12 billion in electric vehicle incentives. Behind this American embrace of industrial policy are concerns about economic resilience, national security, overdependence on supply chains dominated by China, and the need to ensure a fair transition in the face of massive technological change. I know these are concerns that many countries share. The Republican nominee, Donald Trump, has been scornful of the need for an energy transition and has promised to undo much of the work of the IRA in particular. On China, Trump has promised much higher tariffs, a repeal of permanent normal trade relations, and assorted other decoupling initiatives. Sarah, I want to turn to you first. As someone who had a front row seat to the turn toward industrial policy, how durable do you think these new industrial policies are? How will they fare on a second Trump administration?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. I think actually the policies put in place in the Biden administration are quite durable. There are, for sure, some pieces of the Inflation Reduction Act that may be vulnerable, but so much of the investment has taken place in red states and blue states, and nobody likes to eliminate jobs in the United States. So where we are watching most closely is certain provisions of the IRA. And remember that Mr. Trump would not only have to win himself, but also sweep of the Congress, and actually sweep it quite significantly in the Senate, because there are some moderate members of his own party in the Senate, from Maine and Alaska in particular, that are not going to really be amenable to that. So, but if it is a big sweep, then potentially the consumer EV credit is possibly vulnerable, and then potentially some more restrictions around on the production credits and 45X, some foreign entity of concern, some tightening. But I really think where we'll have to watch most closely is in the rulemaking, in the executive branch. There are lots of different ways to define a foreign entity of concern. You could define it in a way that would make it very difficult for almost any material to qualify. And there are things that the Biden administration has done to accelerate deployment, whether it be the exception for graphite for a couple of years while the transition takes place, and some of the leasing provisions allowing leased vehicles that a Trump administration could change on the rulemaking. So I do think there are going to be shifts, but by and large, a lot of money is still going to go out the door, and a lot of this transition is still going to take place.
Great, thank you, Sarah. So it turns out that the devil's in the details, and we're fortunate to have you guide us through that. Turning to you, Hang-Koo, as a Korean government minister, you assisted this country, Korea, in responding to changes in past U.S. policies. How would you advise the current government to prepare for the, upcoming elections outcome, whatever it may be?
Thank you, Mary, for leading this very interesting discussion. I think we need to reflect on, the several years that we have gone through so far. I think in retrospect, the inflection point was, 2017, when the former president, Trump, came in, and all of a sudden he tried to tear apart Chorus FTA, and also he, for the first time, imposed this Section 232 on steel based on national security concern. So I think that is a really clear break from the era that we had lived in, which is a multilateral rule-based, international rule-based, this trading system. But I think Korea has relatively coped with these big changes well. Back in 2018, Korea and the U.S. government at that time, this former president administration, we amended this KOROS FTA. Actually, Korea became the first country that have concluded any trade agreement with the Trump administration. And then also Section 233 on steel as well. And then after that, I think Korea was able to, and also Korean companies were able to sort of enjoy relatively stable trade environment for the next 4 years of Trump administration. So I'm sure that the Korean government is preparing for all eventuality, and then that is sort of continuing the U.S. industrial policy, whether it's IRA and the CHIPS Act, all these kind of further implementation down the road, and also America First. I think when you look at this undercurrent of this U.S. Politics and economy, I think two big sort of trends that we have to really be mindful of. Number one is U.S. really effort to revive manufacturing sector because of this, all the left behind regions and in the Midwest. And so politically, I think this trend will continue in the U.S. And second, I think there's China. China is a big elephant in the room. And I mean, in the U.S. policies right now, whether it's industrial policy or trade policy or whatever domestic policy, I think China is, the underlie all these policy considerations. So I think Korean government and also Korean corporation have to really take into consideration. This is a big, kind of a big picture and the big trend. And lastly, I think what is important is, number one, pragmatic approach. I think that's what Korean government did, the 2017-18. As I said, at first, Korean government really tried to stick to this principle of free trade and then no quota whatsoever. But I think the Korean government at that time was sort of quick to change course and then were the first country to have concluded the agreement. And then also, I think give and take, everything is give and take. Yeah. We need to have more holistic view of this security issue as well as economic issue. So yes, there will be challenges, but if you really try to find more kind of a win-win solution, I think also there would be opportunities as well.
Well, thank you for sort of zooming out and putting this larger context on the table. I want to add a third, which is they're going to face a ballooning federal budget deficit. The expiration of the Trump-era tax cuts and calls for new spending. So we're unlikely to see, in my view, any new costly programs enacted by the Congress. However, industrial policy takes many forms, and some tools have the advantage of being off budget. So, for example, we have seen China and the US deploy domestic content restrictions to promote domestic EV production. Recently, the US, Canada, the EU, and some other countries have placed tariffs on imports of Chinese EVs into their home market, another tool that can be used to promote domestic production that is off budget. So as former trade negotiators, and I don't get that many chances to have these captive trade negotiators here to answer my questions, how do you view the link between trade policy and industrial policy? And in particular, this turn toward discriminatory, and I use that word to mean ones that are selective restraints on certain countries. How do you view this turn toward discriminatory trade policy? What kinds of new protectionisms do you think we might see after the election, and where will we see it?
Well, you've raised a lot of issues with that question, and I think a couple of important things. First of all, as you noted, I do not believe the next administration will have a very robust legislative agenda. They do need to resolve the tax issue next year with the expiration of the Trump tax cuts. That will cost somewhere in the $4 trillion range. You can shrink it a little bit. There's not a lot of appetite to raise taxes in the United States. That will be a thing, and if we see little bits and changes to the IRA, we'll see it, I believe, in that bill. Trump is more likely to have a sweep if he wins, although the House could still go Democrat. So I think you're right to look beyond big legislative programs. President Trump, because he does, as we saw the first time, the good news is we've seen how these people govern. Very, very active in the tariff space, in the trade space. Very, very aggressive in his use of provisions that they believe they can do through executive orders. And I sit on a lot of panels with Trump trade experts. They are ready to go. They know exactly what authorities they'll be using. It will be quick. I do not believe that it will be the scope of what we are seeing in the campaign in terms of it's not going to be a 60% across the board a tariff on every import from China into the United States, and it's not going to be a 10 to 20% tariff on every other country import. But make no mistake, they are very serious about trade, and they are very, very focused on the trade deficit that the United States has with any given country, whether or not there is an FTA or not. I think they will be particularly focused on Mexico, given some of the concerns about immigration and some of what they're seeing in the auto industry, the EU, but any country, including Korea, that has a trade deficit with the United States should be on high alert. And I think you are right to say Korea is a very good model of somebody who's a country who went through this process with a Trump administration. You can negotiate a deal. I think was quite a favorable deal to Korea. But all of that is going to be back. I think regardless, I think you was well put. There is still a very much an America first, and there is the sort of China kind of boogeyman. A lot of concerns about Chinese electric vehicles and their ability to penetrate the United States. I think one of the things we are starting to see, it's not really just trade tariff policy, it's a more comprehensive concern about some of these higher technology products coming in, and whether it's the race on semiconductors or electric vehicles, lots of concerns. These are higher tech products, and so one of the things the Biden administration is currently looking at about Chinese EVs coming in is, even if they bank shot through Mexico or another place, it's not necessarily the country of origin. Is there a technology or a security risk given how these vehicles can, collect data and can radar into sensitive things. So I think all of that's going to continue to be a very big issue, no matter who is president, whether it is again, we'll continue to see it in the semiconductor space. I believe we'll continue to see it in the electric vehicle and battery and clean energy transition as well.
That was a very comprehensive response. Thank you for that. If I may follow up very quickly.
Sure.
Because we are here in Korea. You mentioned that you did not believe that even under a Trump administration, we would see the 10% to 20% across the board tariff. Obviously, this is very concerning to our trade partners. If you don't think we're going to see that, do you think we'll see some kind of across the board tariff under a Trump administration?
So what I don't think they will do is 10% or 20% across the board with every single country. That might be the shot across the bow, and it is important, and you were in the Korean government going through this. The way that President Trump likes to negotiate, as you know, is to throw out a big idea and work from there. I think that ultimately they will choose to leave some products. I think what is different this time is they're talking about universal. That's not how they governed last time. The China tariffs were not on every product. They hesitated on some consumer goods. There is inflation going on in the United States. So I believe they will pick certain products. And I also, and so it won't be universal on every import. I also believe that they will focus their efforts on some countries and not all. So any country where the United States does not have a trade deficit but has a trade surplus, I think will, ultimately be exempted. I think they will use it as a starting point to go through and negotiate with any partner. So I expect there to be some very disruptive, market-moving tariffs from a second Trump term, for sure. I just think they're going to drop this idea of every single country and every single product.
Wow, thank you very much for that, Sarah. It's having been in the trade field for quite some time, I have to say how far we've come where tariffs are now going to be on certain sectors in certain countries. We've moved so far away from MFN and preferential trade agreements. It really makes your head spin. Hanku, let me turn to China, because Sarah did raise the fact that China is a kind of a bipartisan concern, and we're likely to see more draconian policies taken against the Chinese trade flows. Looking at countries outside the U.S.-China bilateral relationship, what challenges do you see for Korea and other countries? Because as the U.S. pursues the further decoupling, de-risking, diversification, whatever D word you want to apply to it, countries like Korea do have investment in China. They do receive intermediate inputs from China. Will they be affected by stricter or stronger attempts to decouple from the U.S.?
I think that's a very important and complicated question. And actually, Mary and I were in China last week, and then had time to kind of first-hand experience of where all the Chinese, economy and technology. I think these people in the U.S. Tend to just look at the U.S.-China angle, but I think in a way, this third country, actually at the Peterson Institute we call it third country, excluding the U.S. and China, like EU, Korea, Japan, ASEAN, all these countries, they are the one which are more affected by this ongoing the U.S.-China trade, the trade tension. What I mean by that is that now the U.S. market is relatively safe from the export surge from China because of all the high tariff and then non-tariff measures that the U.S. government put in place. So now what is happening, all these exports which should have been, gone into the U.S. market are being diverted to a less extent the European Union, but also to ASEAN, this Korea and Japan. So I think this is a global issue. If you look at this WTO data, since 2022, almost 30 or 40% of all new trade measures, including the countervailing duties and the anti-dumping duties, are targeted against China. All this new green industry, but also steel, chemical, plastic, etc. But all these third country, they don't really have big market or big leverage to confront the China. So also they are kind of afraid of sort of economic retaliation if they kind of put in place some kind of protective measure. So I think this is really a dilemma. So I think Korea, that's why it is important to maintain this more international rule-based in the multilateral trading system. So I think there is a role that Korea can play in cooperation with other like-minded countries like the European Union and Japan. And no matter what happens in the US election, I think if these countries could work together and just try to advance those common agenda, I think that would contribute to this stabilizing, not whole a lot, but to a certain degree, to contribute to this global trading system.
Let me ask about cooperation. So a new report from the European Commission, headed by Mario Draghi, is making the news today And among other things, the report emphasizes the need not only for more funding for targeted industrial policies in Europe, but also the pressing need for coordination within the European Union itself. But it strikes me that some of the arguments made in the report also apply to wider cooperation and coordination, say between the US and its allies in East Asia, as well as Europe. So in particular, some positive spillovers from industrial policy go beyond domestic borders, such as the benefits of decarbonization. The US has made this argument that the US subsidizing new energy is good for the rest of the world, particularly when it came under some criticism for subsidizing. But it also may result in too little domestic investment in other places. So there is the issue of economies of scale, and I think that one of the fears that countries face when they look at a large influx of Chinese EVs is that their own domestic producers will never be able to reach the scale that they need to be competitive on the global stage. Smaller countries need access to large markets if they're going to gain a piece of these new technologies. So there's already been some obvious failures of coordination. We've seen them. We've already discussed one indirectly in the IRA. Sarah mentioned leasing rules. So one problem with the IRA was, of course, that the restrictions hit Korea very hard and had to be dealt with by implementing rules that remove these domestic content restrictions for leased as opposed to purchased EVs. So in other words, if I lease an EV made outside the United States, I will be eligible for the full consumer tax credit, but I won't be if I buy the vehicle outright. And that has worked. So far, we've seen that this patch, has worked. We've had an enormous increase in the share of Korean cars, in particular, that are financed by leasing. So, really a couple of questions. So, Sarah, I think we're really profiting by your insights about what might happen after the election. So, will these patches to the IRA survive if a second Trump administration comes into power? And that would have important implications for Korea. So, are there any other ways around this problem?
It's a great question, and I like how you laid out a lot of the issues. I do not believe all of the patches will survive. I think really there's a lot of dramatic differences between President Biden and President Trump, but the role of allies in the United States is as fundamentally different as it gets. And you have seen a Biden not always making everyone happy, but the door is always open for the conversation. And there were accommodations, and the legislation was compromised, and there were unintended consequences, and we've talked about a little bit of that. President Trump really, in some ways, built his kind of theory of the case, like you were talking about in 2017, by saying the United States doesn't get a good enough deal from a lot of its allies. Very, very different theory of the case. Very different theory of the case from many, many Republicans and Democrats. But he has driven that, and we've seen how it governs. And so I don't think you will see this kind of bending rules, trying to come up with creative solutions. I have been on trade panels where at least some prior Trump advisors have said they thought the leasing provision was not appropriate in the statute. The good news for Korean companies is some of the plants are further along, particularly, and so some of the production that was not possible when the IRA first happened, that final production requirement in the United States is now more possible. But I don't know that Trump will 100% necessarily get rid of it, but I think it is something for sure to watch. But it came from a place not only of understanding the perspective of countries like Korea that were making such a big investment, but also a real desire on the Biden administration to deploy clean energy, to make the law work and use it as much as possible. Believes in it, it's his legacy. I think Trump is less committed to the transition, and so isn't going to see if no vehicles qualify for 30D consumer credit, maybe so be it. Now, Trump is complicated, and there's a lot of new relationships that we see, including with Elon Musk, so I don't know. And you always have to watch with the politician, the campaign versus governance, for sure. He, I think, has played the EV issue politically in actually a pretty interesting and pretty smart way, given some of the anxieties that exist in some of the states like Pennsylvania, where this election is going to be decided. They are anxious about the transition, and so he is playing into I think, some of that anxiety. When he is done running, how he will execute around those policies, a little bit less clear. Again, politicians like to do ribbon cuttings, they like investment, they like that. So I don't think the jury's totally out on he will implement the Inflation Reduction Act. Let me just point one that he 100% for sure will change, and that is the EPA rules that really require lower levels of emission quite strictly going forward. That, as much as the incentives, will help drive EV penetration, and that for sure will go away if Trump is reelected.
Great. I want to thank you both for discussing this topic, industrial policy and trade policy, and for giving us some optimism in the face of a world that is facing incredible geopolitical tensions, and also, helping us to see a path forward. So thanks so much, Han-Ku Yao and Sarah Bianchi. Thank you for your comments and for being here today.
Thank you.